Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. Following the truth wherever it leads. Exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites. Revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from the Great White North and his studio beneath the stairs. Here's Richard.
And away we go. Welcome to the broadcast. I get a lot of email about the theme song, and maybe I can prevent you from sending an email. If you're wondering what the name of the song is, I get a lot of emails. What's the name of that song? I love the theme song. It's an original composition for the Conspiracy Show, and the composer-performer is Jeff Eden, E-D-E-N, Jeff Eden. And people are emailing me asking, where can I hear this song? Where can I download it? I believe Jeff has an MP3, a downloadable MP3 on his website. It's Studio 8. That's the numeral 8.ca, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, kudos to Jeff Eden, who penned that or composed that theme song for us. Just looking at some amazing video footage from NASA. Have you seen this? The biggest explosion ever seen on the moon? This meteor impact? Wow, talk about fireworks. I tweeted that, so if you go to my Twitter page, go to the website, richardsyrett.com, and if you haven't subscribed to my Twitter feed, please do so, at Richard Syrett, and you can see the video of the fireworks on the moon. Now, our little humble fireworks we held earlier this evening in celebration of Queen Victoria Day. Not quite as spectacular, perhaps, but we certainly enjoyed it, certainly the little ones. I love fireworks. They just make me so happy. And the children, of course, adore fireworks. What else is going on in the news I wanted to tell you about? Oh, the Pope certainly has had a busy couple of days. Pope Francis I, freshly minted pontiff, warning about the evils of the cult of money. That certainly is true. And I see where he was visiting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, asking for more regulation, financial reforms. And then, just a few hours ago, calling for renewal in the Catholic Church as he wrapped up 2 days of mass gatherings in St. Peter's Square, aimed at energizing the faithful. Renewal in the Catholic Church is interesting because there are those who argue that the end is nigh for the Catholic Church, certainly for the Pope. In fact, they argue, including my next guest, that Pope Francis I will be the final pope. And all of this was predicted by Saint Malachy, going back 900 years ago. Malachy, writing in Prophecy of the Popes, said that the final pontiff would be Peter the Roman, and his reign would end with the destruction of Rome and judgment. The prophecies, first published in 1595, were attributed, as I say, to Saint Malachy by Benedictine historian Arnold de Wyon, who recorded them in his book Lignum Vitae. And tradition holds that Malachy has been called to Rome by Pope Innocent II. While there, he experienced a vision of the future popes, including the last one, which he wrote down in a series of cryptic phrases. According to the prophecy, the next pope is to be the final pontiff, Petrus Romanus, or Peter the Roman. Some Catholics believe that the next pope will basically herald the beginning of the great apostasy, followed by the great tribulation, setting the stage for the imminent unfolding of apocalyptic events, something many non-Catholics might agree with. And here to explain more is the co-author of Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here, Cris Putnam. Cris has a diverse range of interests and life experiences. After earning a music scholarship and studying classical guitar, he performed in various venues with musical theater ensembles and taught lessons. After living the lifestyle of a starving artist, he changed focus to the computer industry and worked for a major technology company implementing encryption protocols and login tools. In his late 30s, he came to the end of himself and turned his life over to Jesus Christ. Since then, his interest in the Bible and theology has driven him to serious study. He earned a Master's of Arts degree in Theological Studies from Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary in 2011, in addition to his Bachelor of Science in Religion and Mathematics. As well as his involvement in book projects, he's now pursuing postgraduate studies at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He is a member of Providence Baptist Church, where he performs regularly with the Praise Band. He's a member of the International Society of Christian Apologetics, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and the Tau Sigma National Honor Society. His website is www.logosapologia.org. The mission of Logos Apologia is to show that logic, science, history, and faith are complementary, not contradictory, and to bring that life-changing truth to everybody who wants to know. Chris Putnam, welcome to The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Hey, it's great to be on The Conspiracy Show with you tonight.
And we should mention your co-author, of course, Tom Horn. Together, the two of you wrote, Petrus Romanus, the Final Pope is Here. So why don't we start, first of all, give us a sense of who St. Malachy was.
Well, he was the first Irish saint, so he's the first person from Ireland to be made a saint. He was known as a reformer. You're talking about the 12th century, so it's really like right as the church and really the world is kind of coming, and Europe is coming out of the Dark Ages, a period really where the papacy had kind of gotten pretty corrupted. But at this point, they were trying to turn somewhat of a new leaf, and Malachy was trying to straighten out Ireland, and he actually made a pilgrimage to Rome to see the Pope about getting some new dioceses approved and some various church business. But it was on that trip to Rome in 1135 AD that is when he, according to legend, had this vision where he saw 112 popes into the future from his day, and that is what you described as the famous prophecy of the popes there at the beginning of the show.
And some of these prophecies, many of them, you would contend after 1595, you would focus on those the popes that came after 1595. Just give us some examples of the accuracy. I understand that he utilized, obviously he didn't name them by name, but he used mottos, which popes often have. They have coat of arms and things like that. Give us some examples of St. Malachy's accuracy in predicting the names or the identities of the various popes.
Well, sure. And, just to clarify, you said, the ones after 1595. And, the reason to do that, of course, is that between the time that he allegedly, delivered this prophecy and it was written down in the 12th century and when we can actually prove that, that we have a copy of it, there's a big gap of time missing there. So, one of the criticisms a lot of the skeptics, even Catholic scholars who are skeptical about this thing will point out that it looks like somebody cooked the books interloping period between when he gave it and the publishing date. So really, just to kind of brush those arguments aside, you really only need to look at the ones after we can prove it was published and widely disseminated. So, I kind of just sidestep that whole debate, and I do explain that debate in some detail in the book, but like you said, the thing that is important to me is this a real prophecy? Does it have any evidence that it really does predict the future? And, it's widely distributed in 1595, so nobody disputes that as an anchor point. Then, if you look at some of the fulfillments are pretty compelling. The one that really captured my attention the most was actually the one for Benedict XV. Now, he was Pope from 1914 to 1922. And the little Latin motto that was assigned to him in the sequence, it said, Religio depopulata. Now, that just means religion depopulated. Now, this is the kind of prediction that it kind of stands out on the list, to be honest with you, because it's a falsifiable kind of claim. Religion depopulated, that's kind of a risky prediction. His reign could have been marked by revival in the church, or, all things being equal, you just expect things to kind of remain about the same. It might go up a little or a little down a little bit. Religion depopulated, that's pretty bold.
Yeah, he's going out on a limb there for sure.
It is, and, and that's kind of the way you would test something like this, and, in remarkable fulfillment, really remarkable to me, 1914 to 1922 is when the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in Russia. And, historians will say 200 million people left the church there because, Lenin and Stalin targeted the churches and the religious leaders, and they even bulldozed them. And there's films of them using wrecking balls, knocking churches down, because they saw religion as something that would, cause people to stand up to the state. With a communist totalitarian regime, that's the sort of thing they wanted to get rid of, so they did.
That was the Orthodox Church, was it not? The Russian Orthodox
Church? It was both. It was all churches.
Okay.
But, here we have this prediction, religion is populated, so you have the Bolshevik Revolution, but also this is the time when World War I breaks out, which is devastating to Europe and the church as well. So, it really does appear to be a pretty good match because, to me, the whole rise of militant communism, they really did try to enforce atheism. And, there's lots of testimonies to that end. Richard von Braun, who's the guy who started the charity called Voice of the Martyrs, if you've ever heard his testimony, they would torture him and try to force him to say God didn't exist and things like this. It really does seem to be a very compelling match for that one. Now, some of the other ones, a lot of them seem to match heraldry. And Roman Catholicism, heraldry is like the coat of arms, and it's kind of an art and a science, and they have rules, and certain symbols mean certain things, but a lot of these phrases seem to match the heraldry of particular popes. So one of the ones that is really like a dead ringer in recent history is Paul VI, who was the Pope in 1963 to 1978, and the Latin phrase for him was flos florum, which means flower of flowers. Now, his coat of arms has three what you call fleur de lis, which is a heraldic device of the French monarchy, and it literally means in French flower of the lily. So you have these three little yellow flower things, which matches flower of flower quite well.
Yes, and again, we should be reminding listeners that this is St. Malachy writing in the 12th century.
Mm-hmm. And we can prove that it was published in 1595. So here we are, 400 years later. The first thing I thought, though, was what if, maybe these popes or cardinals who are thinking that they might have aspirations to be pope, maybe they're aware of this prophecy and
the self-fulfilling prophecy. That's a great point. Listen,
say,
Chris.
Well, yeah, let's maybe I'll pick my coat of arms and make it match the next one on the list. And
let's explore that when we come back, Chris. We'll take a time out. We'll come back. Chris Putnam, co-author of Petrus Romanus. The final pope is here. Back with more of the Conspiracy Show. Don't go.
The truth goes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
In Petrus Romanus, the final pope is here. Co-authors Tom Horn and Chris Putnam. Chris joins us on the line. They examine St. Malachy's prophecy of the pope, said to be based on his prophetic vision of the next 112 popes, beginning with Pope Celestine II, who died in 1144. Malachy presented a description of each pope, culminating with the final pope, Peter the Roman, whose reign, it is said, would end with the destruction of Rome and judgment. Chris Putnam, as I say, is with us, co-author, and will eventually get around to discussing how Pope Francis I fits into that prophecy, keeping in mind again that Malachy said the final pope would be Petrus Romanus. Right now, though, we're discussing how St. Malachy's prophecies of the various popes seem to come true, and you were talking about Pope Paul VI. Can we talk a little bit about Pope John Paul I? This is also a fascinating one, which I believe has to do with the lunar eclipse.
That's right, yeah. I'll just finish off the thought with Paul VI. All I was going to say there at the end was I did want to kind of debunk the idea that maybe they just picked it to match the prophecy.
Right, yes, thank you. The self-fulfilling
prophecy. There are rules in heraldry for these guys, and you have to have your coat of arms in place by the time that you're made a bishop. And that's, for most of these guys, that's long before they're even a candidate to be a pope. So you literally have to anticipate it 20, 30 years ahead in your career, which doesn't really seem likely because you'd have to know when the next pope was going to die and, when you would be in the sequence.
That's an excellent point. So to cover their bets, all of the bishops thinking one day I might be cardinal and then I might be pope, they would all have a fleur-de-lis as part of their coat of arms.
It would be ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I don't think that can explain it away. Yeah, like you said, John Paul I, he's interesting because he only lived as Pope for 33 days. And there's a lot of people that think he was poisoned. In fact, the Jesuit who kind of left the Jesuit order to write books, Father Malachy Martin, he actually said that John Paul I was poisoned because he was going to expose a bunch of high-ranking Vatican officials who were Freemasons. And this was all tangled up with some skullduggery at the Vatican bank, and a lot of things happened back around that time. This was in 1978. And, I don't know if you're aware, but we have a new book out called Exo Vaticana, which kind of covers the Vatican strange interest in extraterrestrials.
Ah, yes, they have that huge telescope down, I believe, is it in Tucson or Arizona?
It's right outside of Tucson. I actually visited it last fall. It's on Mount Graham, near Safford, Arizona, little town. And me and my co-author Tom Horn toured that facility. But the reason why I mentioned that is, well, let's just talk about John Paul I, like he said. So from the midst of the moon was his Malachys Prophecy. Now, what kind of makes it a fulfillment is that the day that he became the Pope was actually a half moon. It was a perfect half moon. And then, he only lives 33 days. So he was also from the diocese of Belluno. Well, in Latin, that would translate to beautiful moon, bel, beautiful, luno, moon. So, he actually came from an area called the Beautiful Moon. He ascended the papacy on the precise day of a half moon. So that corresponds pretty nicely to the midst of the moon. But what's really strange is this year, 1978, was the famous year of 3 popes. So Paul VI, the one we were just talking about, dies. They elect John Paul I. He becomes Pope right on the half moon, as we said. He's only Pope for 33 days. Right in the middle of that 33 days, there was a massive UFO flap over Rome. And this is really well documented. It's not just the sort of thing that we just went hunting for. In fact, when we wrote the book, Petrus Romanus, I didn't have any idea about the UFO incident. But when we started researching Exo Vaticana, one of the things I tried to do was let's just research, UFO sightings over Rome and see if there's any pattern or any, suggestive sort of timing. Well, this was the most amazing thing because this is having 3 popes in one calendar year is pretty unprecedented. But the UFO sightings over Rome this year were so widespread and so well documented that it's just incredible. There's really been no other time like it in history. In fact, it made the New York Times in America in 1978.
Which is interesting because if you flash ahead about 30 years, you had that interesting announcement by the chief Vatican astronomer at the observatory you just mentioned near Tucson saying, I believe he's the chief astronomer who issued this statement, saying it's okay for Catholics to believe in E.T.
Yeah, that was actually, he delivered that from Rome. It was by Father Jose Funes, and he's an important character. He is the leader now of the Vatican Observatory Research Group, and he actually issued a document that was posted in Latin and in English called The Extraterrestrial is My Brother. So he went quite a bit further than just saying it's okay to believe in them. I mean, you could look, one of the things that I challenge listeners to do who kind of think that I'm really getting out on a limb when we start talking about the UFOs and the alien thing. Well, this is the stuff that they're talking about. Our readers who had read Petrus Romanus were asking us these questions. Well, what do you make of all these statements that the Vatican's making about that? So it's really their own language. What I would challenge listeners to do that just kind of think this is just going too far is just type in your favorite search engine and type baptized extraterrestrial and hit search. And you'll get hundreds of hits, and they'll all be interviews with Jesuit astronomers from what they call the Vatican Observatory Research Group, and the acronym is VORG. So I had a little bit of fun with that.
Well, this is actually a great sort of little a preview because Chris, I'd like to have you and maybe Tom back on, and we can talk about the new book.
Sure.
But I sort of got you a little bit sidetracked, although it was certainly worth the side journey. Thank you for that. But let's get back to. Can we move on to Pope John Paul II?
Sure.
Because I believe the motto there has something to do with the labor of the sun.
Yeah. So as soon as as John Paul dies, they actually embalmed his body within 24 hours, which a lot of people thought was very suspicious and maybe evidence of that some kind of hanky-panky went on. So then John Paul II is elected, and of course he's the famous pope that everyone remembers. Now his motto was from the labor of the sun. Now this one is even more compelling in a lot of ways. He was, a lot of people would interpret labor of the sun perhaps as eclipse of the sun. So he was actually born on May 18th, 1920, during a partial solar eclipse. And then to kind of top that off, it turns out that he was buried during a hybrid eclipse as well. So from the labor of the sun, it's a lot of people think that that is the fulfillment of that prophecy. The eclipse is associated with his birth and burial.
And it bears repeating for those just joining us. This was a prophecy made by St. Malachi 900 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's...
So, those are pretty interesting. Now, the other thing, like we talked about, could this be a self-fulfilling prophecy? Well, my co-author Tom Horn tends to think that, a lot of times it is, and there is evidence that there have been several popes who seem to have gone out of their way to claim this thing for themselves or to make it fit. Now, one of those will just be going back in time, like we started with Paul VI. If we just go back to the pope before him, it was Pius XII. This is one of the prophecies that, I think it would be fair to say it was kind of vague, when you hear it. His was Pastor Angelicus, which is just Latin. It just means angelic shepherd or angelic pastor. Now, that seems like that's pretty vague. It would be easy for any pope to kind of claim that one. But that's exactly what happened. He not only claimed it of himself, this was during World War II, and he got criticized as being Hitler's pope in a book by John Cromwell. And so there's some controversy over whether he was kind of complicit or whether he didn't say enough about the Holocaust and all that. But the thing that's really interesting, though, is that he actually produced a propaganda film about himself and titled it and Pastor Angelicus. That was like the name of the film. And it even said how, Pope Pius XII characterizes the day in the life of the St. Malachi prophecy. And so he literally applied it to himself and produced a documentary film about himself and named it after his Malachi motto. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, it is a fulfillment of the prophecy. Whether, he made it happen or not, it still counts because, when you look at the sequence, some of these, people couldn't manipulate. Like the one we started with, Benedict XVI, religion depopulated. That really couldn't have been manipulated by a pope. But then you have this one, and this was obviously one that was, but it's still a fulfillment. And the thing that makes it important is that there are Jesuits and Catholic scholars who try to poo-poo this prophecy and distance themselves from it and say, we think this is just a forgery and we don't really take it seriously. Well, it's really hard for them to say that with a straight face when they have one of their popes, who is an infallible leader of the church by their own doctrine, who specifically claimed it of himself. He's certainly trying to distance it from them. He actually claimed it. Now, interestingly, I think you could say the same about the Pope just previous to Francis, Pope Benedict XVI.
The glory of the olive.
The glory of the olive. Now, because of that prophecy, many people, and especially the Catholics, there are a lot of Catholics that pay attention to this prophecy who have been believing it for many years. And they would try typically to predict who the next papal candidate's going to be based on the motto. Now, interestingly, they look at glory of the olive. Well, the olive branch is a symbol of the Benedictine monastic order. So for that reason, a lot of the Catholics that put a lot of stock in the prophecy were watching for a Benedictine monk to be elected pope. Now, when Cardinal Ratzinger from Germany got the nod, they were kind of shocked because he was not a Benedictine monk. But the Pope gets to pick his papal name. He was Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal, and he picked the name Benedict, which is another instance of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It would seem so. I mean, are there other possible explanations behind the glory of the olive, aside from the fact that it was sort of the symbol of the Benedictines?
Well, sure. Well, one of the ones, a lot of people have kind of pointed to this idea that, this is he was the next to the last pope on the list. Now, interestingly, Jesus gave us a prophetic discourse on the end times. It happens to be in Matthew chapter 24. Some of it is in Luke 21. And some of it is in Mark chapter 13 in the Gospels. It was kind of his discourse on the way things would be going near the time of his return, which, of course, would ensue the end times and the events in the apocalypse, the book of Revelation. Now, because of that, it's called the Olivet Discourse, because it was given on the Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem. Well, some people associated this phrase, glory of the olive, with the Olivet Discourse, and being that the sequence of the prophecy has it as the next to the last, Jesus talked about in that discourse what he called birth pains of the end times. Now, this is the kind of a phrase that you're probably familiar with. He'd say things like wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes and famines. It said that we would see these things coming as signs. Now, he said these aren't the signs that the end is here, but they are a sign that it's coming, it's near. They're like birth pains. You know, if you kind of think of the analogy, the way birth pains work is they come closer and closer together, you know, and then the water breaks and boom, you know, it's on. So a lot of prophetic scholars have been paying attention, and, you know, it's probably true that in the 20th century you've had the greatest wars and the most bloodshed in world history.
I think anybody who's paying attention to the news these days, looking at the headlines, could safely argue the water has broke.
Yeah. I mean, the earthquakes really have seemed to increase just in the last few years. I mean, I really have never seen anything like what we've seen. We had that huge one in Haiti, the one in Japan with the nuclear reactor and all that, and then we had a massive one in Chile. There's just been a lot of weather-related events and earthquakes, and I would say that those birth pains have gotten really close together. And most of the people that I know that follow Bible prophecy would concur with that assessment.
Well, Cris Putnam is with us, co-author of Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here, and we're just about to go into a break, but we can at least get this conversation rolling now. And that is something remarkable about your book is you and Tom Horn in the book actually predicted that Pope Benedict would resign, obviously before the fact. We are. I just hear the music, creeping up now. So we'll take a time out. When we come back, let's talk about how you arrived at that prediction, and then we'll move on into the selection of Pope Francis I and how that fits with St. Malachys prophecy. The last pope would be Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. Back with more of The Conspiracy Show and my conversation with Cris Putnam, co-author of Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here.
As you're staring up at the night sky, ever wonder who's staring back? You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Cris Putnam stays with us for a few moments yet, discussing his new book, which he co-authored with Tom Horn, Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here. Now, just a remarkable prediction that you made in that book. Obviously, it was published well before the actual event, and that was the resignation of Pope Benedict, which was, I believe, the first pope to resign in 600 years. Now, how were you able to make that prediction?
Well, I don't like to try to claim any sort of prophetic powers or anything for myself. It was actually based on this prophecy and some of the research that I did and rumors that were coming out of Italy. Now, just to explain, when I first set out to investigate this Malachy prophecy, I really wasn't predisposed to believing extra-biblical Catholic prophecies or anything. I'm a believer in the biblical prophecies, and that was kind of my point of interest because I saw the intersection between the ending of this and the prophecies in the book of Revelation and the ones that we spoke of in the Olivet Discourse and whatnot. So I read a lot of books about this Malachy prophecy. Now, a lot of these are written by various Catholic scholars over the years. Now, one of the more interesting ones was a book written in French by a Belgian Jesuit named René Thibault. Now, he published this book called The Mysterious Prophecy of the Popes in 1951. And I actually found it at a university library, and they brought it up from the basement. I don't think anybody had looked at it in 20 or 30 years. And so I had to translate it from French. Now, the thing that was just incredible is that he predicted the arrival of the final pope on the list in the year 2012. And he didn't just do that kind of in a trivial manner. He did it all throughout the book, and it was like a big feature of the book. In fact, he found like just these fanciful encryption codes within the Latin text of the prophecy. He did all these kind of mystical calculations, and he kept landing on April 2012 as the arrival of Petrus Romanus. Now, you know, you have to imagine at the time, this was probably December or January, or maybe January 2012, or probably December when I first got this book and found this information. And we're trying to get the book out by maybe March of 2012. And so we started rushing just to get the book published because nobody would believe us if it really happened if we didn't get it out in time. So we literally, really put the rush on to get the book out by April of 2012 when he said that this would happen. Well, there was also rumors from the Vatican Insider, which is a magazine in Italy, that Pope Benedict's health was not too good, and so they were speculating that maybe he would retire for that reason. And, so we just kind of put two and two together in the book, and we said, well, if this Belgian Jesuit is right, then we would expect that Pope Benedict will step down for health reasons in April of 2012. And we said, well, any time in the year 2012 would be a pretty incredible prediction, given that he wrote this down probably in 1950. Well, of course, the year 2012 came and went, but it really made our book kind of sensational because everybody was already thinking apocalyptically with the Mayan calendar and all this 2012 stuff. But what would a Jesuit writing in 1950 have? 2012 wasn't on the radar when he wrote that. He had no reason to pick the year 2012 other than he really thought it would be. So, a lot of people would say, well, 2012 came and went, it didn't happen, right? Well, it actually turns out that he was pretty dead on right. Now, here's why. When Pope Benedict did step down this year, it was February 11th, 2013, I believe. I remember it pretty well because it kind of changed everything for us. We'd kind of given up on René Thibault and his 2012 prediction, but the day that Benedict made his announcement, of course, lightning struck St. Peter's Basilica.
That was absolutely astounding.
That was spectacular. But even more spectacular for this prediction was that in the New York Times that very day, there was a little part of the paragraph. I got it right here in front of me, actually. It says that the resignation was long in the planning was confirmed by the editor of the Vatican newspaper, who wrote on Monday that the Pope's decision, quote, was taken many months ago after his trip to Mexico and Cuba in March of 2012, end quote, and kept with the reserve no one could violate, end quote. So literally, when he did a little South American tour in March of 2012, when he got back from that was the end of March, he told a select group of his friends that he was stepping down. Now, if he had followed suit right when he said that would have been April 2012, right when this guy said it in 1950.
That's pretty scary. Incredible. Yeah. So that's clear. Then the decision was made in 2012. So officially he stepped down in 2013, but the decision was made exactly as the Jesuit priest indicated. Now, Cris, obviously your book came out before Pope Francis was named Pope, and you had your own list of 10 possible candidates to succeed Benedict, which would fit the prophecy of the popes, meaning that the final pope had to be Peter the Roman, and one of those was a Cardinal Tarcisio Pietro Evasio Bertoni, the Cardinal Secretary of State. Obviously, that didn't happen, but that would have fit Peter the Roman. But when we come back, we'll talk about some of the others that might have fit nicely with Petrus Romanus, and then I'll get you to explain why Pope Francis I still might be a fulfillment of the prophecy of St. Malachy. Back with my conversation with Chris Putnam, here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't you dare go away.
It's time to redefine reality. This is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Welcome back. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Syrett. Let me spell the last name. S as in Simon, Y-R-E-T-T, at Richard Syrett. And we've got Cris D. Putnam with us, the co-author of Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here, co-authored along with Tom Horn. And I want you to explain how a number of popes that you listed in your book might have fit in nicely with St. Malachys prophecy.
Well, the main guy that seemed to be really compelling at the time was the one that you mentioned right before we went to the break, Tarcisio Bertone. He was the number 2 in charge. He's the Secretary of State for Benedict XVI. Now, the really obvious thing is that his middle name was Pietro, and he was an Italian from Rome, so he would quite literally have matched that Peter the Roman title. But, right off the bat, though, one of the things that we also said in the book all along was that, all popes claim to be the next Peter in line. Their claim to the authority of the papacy is apostolic succession from the Apostle Peter. So they even call the papacy the Petrine office, where they turn the name Peter into an adjective, Petrine. So, they all claim to be a Peter in that sense.
And it's also very, very unlikely that any pope would name himself Peter, because that would just be the height of hubris.
Right, exactly. And so for that reason, if you look at what other scholars have written over the years, for instance, René Thibault, who wrote the book in 1950, what did he think of it? He thought the title Peter the Roman was a symbol that meant that this final pope would encompass all of the papacy. So he really saw it as the final pope would be such a compelling character that he would somehow have the personality of every pope in the whole succession of the office. So he kind of saw it that way. They are a claim to the successor of Peter, and they're the leader of the Roman Church. So it could be just as simple as that, as a symbolic title. And that's kind of the way that I'm choosing to look at it now. There are people who have looked at Pope Francis and have found that, if you look at the long version of his name, his father's name was Pietro. So in the middle of his name, there is a St. Francis of Assisi, I'm sorry. So what some people have done is he chose the name Francis. Francis of Assisi has a Pietro in his middle name. Now, I kind of think that that's just kind of pushing the literalism too far. For me, that's not necessary. Some people are choosing to look at that as the way it matches Francis, because he chose the name Francis of Assisi. Francis of Assisi has Pietro in his middle name. But, if you look at the rest of the prophecy, just the ones that we talked about, none of them really tried to give a literal name for any of the popes. They're all symbolic, like Gloria the Olive or Flower of Flowers. They're all symbols, and they either match an event during the papacy, or something about the coat of arms, or some kind of descriptor. And they're pretty metaphorical and like that. So to me, to try to press it to be literal for the final pope is to kind of decontextualize the prophecy, because it really didn't do that.
That's an excellent point. Did Malachy,
I
though?
don't think it's necessary.
No. Did he leave other clues, though? Did he mention another motto or a heraldry for Francis I, or was it simply Petrus Romanus, and that was the be-all and the end-all?
Okay. Well, the final pope, the prophecy for the final pope is quite a bit different than the rest of the list. The one for the final pope is a little paragraph. It's not a little phrase. It says, "In the extreme persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will nourish the sheep in many tribulations. And when they are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people, the end." So that's the prophecy for our current pope. Now, to me, the way that we find out that this one is fulfilled is if those events happen. And, if they don't, if his papacy ends and they elect another pope and Rome isn't destroyed and, the tribulation doesn't start, then, okay, it's false. Some people are expected that it would literally be somebody named Peter and blah, 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 and so they're thinking, well, it's not true now. But, I don't think you can say that until, his papacy ends with kind of uneventfully.
You talked about the persecution or the tribulations in the church. It's interesting, not too long ago, the chief exorcist for the Vatican said that the devil is loose inside the Vatican. Satan is loose. And now, the chief exorcist, for those who might say, well, exorcism, that belongs back in the Middle Ages. But Pope Benedict was a firm believer in the rite of exorcism, and I believe gave a lot of credence to this particular individual. What did you make of that statement?
Well, he wasn't the only one. Malachy Martin also said very similar things. In fact, he took it a little bit further. But I absolutely do believe in a literal, personal Satan who is the enemy of the Church of Christ. I think he is really the enemy of human beings. The Bible describes him as the little g God of this world. Now, people that aren't familiar with biblical theology might be a little shocked about that, but yes, that's in the letter that Paul wrote to Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. It says, the God of this world blinds the minds of unbelievers. So literally, the Bible teaches that we're kind of in a matrix, that there really is an illusory worldview going on, and I've written about that extensively. But I think that a lot of that has infiltrated some of the high levels of the Vatican. I touched on a little bit when we talked about John Paul I and how a lot of people think he was poisoned for maybe exposing some Freemasons that had infiltrated the Vatican hierarchy. Well, Father Malachy Martin wrote that there was organized Satan worship in the high levels of the Vatican going on in Rome within the Vatican. In fact, he wrote that they did a ritual in 1963 called the enthronement of the fallen Archangel Lucifer. Now, just so your listeners are clear on this, the guy that I'm quoting for this information was a Jesuit priest. He was an advisor to 3 popes. He was in Rome, an advisor to Paul VI and John the 23rd. So he was there, and he had 3 PhDs. He was a very high-level and respected insider in the Vatican. So this isn't just some kind of loopy conspiracy theory. This is kind of a whistleblower. And Malachy Martin died in 1999. He was working on a book about how the Vatican had been absorbed into the New World Order, and he took a tumble down some stairs and died in the hospital shortly after. Now, some people think that maybe he was pushed, because that book never got written. But he did write about this Satanism infiltrating the Vatican. He even quoted Paul VI, the Pope that we talked about, had even made a statement that the smoke of Satan has entered the sanctuary, and that's pretty much a direct quote. I'm quoting it from memory, but it was I think that was pretty accurate.
Right. If Chris, we just have a few moments left, 3 or 4 minutes, but if in fact Francis I is the final pope, how do you see events unfolding from here? Okay.
Well, the thing that makes Francis really interesting is that he's the first Jesuit pope in history. Now, this is unprecedented. Now, Malachy Martin, the first book that he wrote when he got a release from his vows was an expose of the Jesuit order, the order that he was in, that he had just left. Now, he thought that they were undermining the theology of the church, and he wrote in his book, The Jesuits, there's a war between the Jesuit order and the papacy. And he saw that kind of liberal, modernist, communism kind of ideas were infiltrating the church through the Jesuit order. Now, if there was a war between the Jesuit order and the papacy, when he's talking about this like 20 years ago, now today we have the first Jesuit pope, that tells me the war's over and the Jesuits won. How do I see this playing out? Well, that's kind of where we go to our second book. They have made a lot of really controversial statements about outer space, about extraterrestrials. Pope Francis has a master's degree in chemistry. He started his career thinking about being a scientist. Then he went into the Jesuit order. How would we connect these two books, Exo Vaticana and Petrus Romanus? Well, when we turned in the manuscript for Exo Vaticana, we didn't know who the new pope was going to be. But it turns out, as I mentioned earlier, the leader of the Vatican Observatory Research Group is Jose Funes. He happens to be from Argentina. He is the leader of the observatory group, and guess who brought him into the Jesuit order? Cardinal Bergoglio. Pope Francis brought in the leader of the Vatican Observatory Research Group as a neophyte.
That I did not know. That's interesting.
Yeah, that was one of the things I uncovered after the fact, and you just can't make it up. So there's a very intimate connection between Pope Francis and Jose Funes, who wrote this essay, The Extraterrestrial is My Brother. Now, you know, one of the things that our hypothesis in the second book is that for a lot of these events in Bible prophecy to happen in very short order, you know, if they're going to happen in the next few years, like really fast, there's going to have to be some kind of unprecedented paradigm-changing event. And, you know, we think that the world is really poised for something like an alien disclosure type event, and we think that that would probably be the catalyst that would kind of bring the world together and set up maybe a one-world religion and the sorts of things that Bible prophecy talks about. So that's kind of our working hypothesis.
Well, that's funny, or not funny. It's interesting. You know, we're doing this show on the heels of the citizens' hearing on disclosure just wrapped up recently in Washington, D.C., before a panel of 5 former members of Congress, right. All of whom, many of them were skeptics, but all essentially those that were able signed on to you know, this announcement wanting to press the United Nations for, you know, further hearings and more investigations and so forth. So, you know, the parallel there is quite interesting.
Yeah, the timing is quite fortuitous, and some of the testimony really does coincide with the things that we wrote in Exo Vaticana. In fact, Daniel Sheehan was one of the witnesses, a pretty high-ranking attorney. He was the lead counsel for the Jesuit order. He actually tried to subpoena the Vatican UFO records for President Carter and was refused twice. So when they say they don't have any UFO secrets, they are definitely keeping some secrets.
That's fascinating. Well, it is rumored that the Archbishop of Los Angeles was present with President Eisenhower during this secret meeting with several races of ETs. Listen, Cris, this has been fascinating. I hope that you'll come on and perhaps we can get Tom Horn, your co-author, come on back again maybe later on in the summer, and we'll talk about the second book. Are you good for that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Cris.
Okay. My pleasure.
Cris Putnam. Say hello on Twitter again, at Richard Serrett, and your portal into the Conspiracy Show. The website is www.richardserrett.com.
A new Richard Serrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.
Hey, welcome aboard. Glad to have you with us. Hello to all my U.S. affiliates from Anchorage, Alaska, down to Asheville, North Carolina. For those of you listening online at zoomerradio.ca, and those of you listening closer to home here in the Greater Toronto area, coming to you live from Liberty Village, a neighborhood just north of the Grand Old Lady by the Lake, the Canadian National Exhibition. This is a great neighborhood. And I was just thinking, you know, here we are in Liberty Village, and we are located on Jefferson Avenue. We hold liberty and freedom very, very close to our hearts here on this radio program. I just watched this film this afternoon, and it's a good one. Be on the lookout for it. It's called The Life After Death Project. A great documentary, it says here on the front cover. It certainly is, on a timeless theme, scientific evidence for life after death. It's also the first paranormal biography, the afterlife story of Forrest J. Ackerman, a founding father of Hollywood science fiction who refuses to rest in peace. And joining us on the line is Paul Davids, an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose films include The Sci-Fi Boys and Jesus in India. He's also known for executive producing and co-writing Showtime's original TV movie, Roswell, which was nominated for a Golden Globe as Best Motion Picture for Television. Paul Davids, a great delight to have you aboard here on The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very good. I think I count as one of your American affiliates.
You do. The Life After Death Project. First of all, congratulations on this documentary. First of all, for those not familiar with, I mean, there's a lot more here. It's not just about the afterlife story of Forrest J. Ackerman, although he certainly looms large in this film. Explain to those not familiar with Forrest J. Ackerman, who was he?
He was one of the forefathers of contemporary science fiction in film and literature. He was born in 1916 and grew up through the silent era. And he was one of the first major promoters of science fiction in film. He was one of the people who got Ray Bradbury started, Ray Harryhausen started. Ray Harryhausen left us just a week ago, I think. In 1958, Forry Ackerman founded with James Warren a very, very popular magazine that has had a long life and is still going today, called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And it was a very humorous look at movie monsters, and kids really enjoyed it. I grew up with it, and I sure wasn't alone of those who went into the film business who grew up with it and loved it, because its fans, include all the big people in science fiction and fantasy movies, certainly including Lucas and Spielberg and Rick Baker and Dennis Muren, and John Landis, Joe Dante. The list just goes on and on and on of the people who, of course, Peter Jackson, of those who Ackerman inspired. He was a very strange and wonderful man, had a great sense of humor, was very generous, and he lived in an 18-room house in the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles that he called the Acker Mansion. And it was absolutely filled in every single room, in every corner, every speck of every wall, and including the bathrooms, with some of the greatest memorabilia of the whole history of horror and science fiction films going back to the silent days, including lots of original relics from King Kong. This is a man that figures largely in the Life After Death Project, because this is really how I got involved in this, through the back door. I mean, I was one of Forry's boys. From the time I was a teenager, I entered a movie contest in Famous Monsters. I was a winner. I was getting national publicity in the magazine, and I was barely in high school at that point. And then I went to Hollywood and befriended him, and we were friends for decades. He finally passed away December 4th, 2008. He was
an avowed atheist, correct?
He said he was. He was a skeptic. He declared himself an atheist. He said he didn't believe in an afterlife. But for those who really knew him well, there was some waffling in his position. I mean, there was some ambiguity there. He had written a fictional short story about a boy who went to heaven and met up with his idol Lon Chaney, who played the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And the twist of the story was this boy was a hunchback, and he gets to heaven, and he is non-physical, doesn't have a body anymore, and he's freed of his deformity, and he finds happiness. That was fiction, of course. But there was an interesting sort of paranormal incident in Forry's family. His father, George Wyman, was the brilliant architect who designed the Bradbury Building in Los Angeles. Very famous building that figures prominently in Blade Runner. His grandfather wasn't going to take that job, but there was sort of a seance and a Ouija board reading, and the message that came through was, take the Bradbury Building and you will succeed. And Forry kept that scrawled message and framed it, kept it in the living room, showed it to people, forever. So for someone who said, there's no afterlife, he doesn't believe in the paranormal, everything about his life dabbled in the paranormal. He said it was all fiction, but still there were these incidents.
And did he not, near the end of his life, say to his personal assistant, if there is a big convention, Comic-Con convention or what have you in the sky, and I'm able to communicate with you, much the way that Harry Houdini did, I guess. If there's a way, I will.
Yeah, he said that. It wouldn't have been Comic-Con necessarily, although he did frequent Comic-Con I was there with him, actually, at one of the last Comic-Cons. We signed autographs for a movie that I made he was in called The Sci-Fi Boys. But no, it wouldn't have been a world science fiction convention. It would have been a heavenly science fiction convention. And if he woke up to that, he said that when all the hoopla died down and he was done palling around with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi and Peter Lorre and all his other great friends of the horror and science fiction films, if it was possible to do it, he'd drop a line back here in the physical reality of Earth. You know, he said it with a big twinkle in his eye, and yet, after he died, it was a few months later that a huge tribute was held for him in Hollywood at the Egyptian Theater, and that was the day that this all started. That was the day that things started that just took people by surprise. They couldn't explain away. It was Fari saying hello in all different kinds of ways, and when I first heard about it, the day of the tribute, I was one of the speakers there. I thought, guys, this is really interesting. What is this? One of the Canadian filmmakers who was there. Oh, you're in Toronto. Well, he's Ian Johnston. He lives in Toronto.
Yes.
Get him on your show. He and his friend Mike McDonald from Halifax were the first two. They'd made a film about Fari Ackerman. They came to the tribute. The film was going to be presented there. And before the tribute, they visited his crypt.
At Forest Lawn. Forest Lawn.
Yes, Forest. He rapped on it. The crypt 3 times, Uncle Fari, are you there? And he never would have rapped on anybody else's crypt, but it was the kind of relationship everybody had with him. It was one of fun, lightheartedness. But they got back to the room they were staying in, and 2 things happened with their computers, bang, 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 that made them absolutely convinced that he was knocking back to them. And I took this in, and I thought, what do you do with that? They were sincere. I believed it really happened. Was it Fari? It's a hard leap to make. I've been a skeptic on most things for most of my life until something happens that convinces me I can't be a skeptic anymore. And that's what happened to me about a week after the tribute. Something happened to me that was just impossible.
Well, yeah,
couldn't happen, but it happened.
We're going to take a time out here in a moment, and then we'll find out what happened to you. Let me just ask you quickly before we go into the break, and that is, had you intended, before this amazing event happened to you one night down in New Mexico, had you intended to make a film about life after death, or...
Oh, no. No. It wasn't on my radar at all. No. I had a list of films I wanted to make. It wasn't even down there at the bottom. It wasn't there. Mm-mm.
Unbelievable. And very quickly as well, the event that happened to these 2 Canadian filmmakers, they're in their hotel.
Yeah.
One of them has a laptop open, and he's
blogging onto Facebook, trying to post pictures from the crypt. And you have to put in the code, the squiggle lines that come up, so that Facebook knows you're not a spammer.
Right.
Yeah. And what comes up is Ackerman 000. He rapped on the crypt, knock, 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 and his name comes back on the computer as the code with 3 zeros. They say, this is impossible. Is he really dead? And the other computer that was asleep at the time blurts out in a childlike voice, oh my gosh, no way. That's what happened.
And that's just the beginning.
That was the beginning.
We'll come back in conversation with Paul Davids, the Life After Death Project, here on The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
The truth goes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Paul Davids is with us, filmmaker. The documentary is the Life After Death Project. Sort of think CSI meets The Ghost Hunter. 4 New York Times best-selling authors, 3 top science professors, 3 well-respected mediums make a leap into the unknown, investigating astonishing evidence in the case of apparent after-death communication, ADC, from sci-fi luminary Forrest J. Ackerman. And for you, so you speak with these 2 Canadian filmmakers who, along with you, had attended the tribute to the late Mr. Ackerman.
Yeah, they have one of the speakers there, along with Guillermo del Toro and John Landis and Peter Jackson.
So they have this
from New Zealand via video.
Sure. Ackerman was a hero to many of filmmakers, obviously, including yourself. So after these 2 Canadian filmmakers have this they're staying, I believe, across the road from Grayman's Theater, and at the time, and they just returned from Forest Lawn after tapping on Ackerman's mausoleum, and then they have this paranormal experience. And then how long was it after that? You were down in New Mexico, and you had
I left Los Angeles a day or two after the tribute and headed for a vacation home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was a week later that my world was turned upside down.
So take us back to that evening.
Well, here was the incident. I mean, it was getting to be tax time. I printed out a document 24 pages long that had my phone calls, business meetings, all that stuff from the previous year, go over and see if there's any tax deductions I hadn't considered. And I pressed the print command. I was alone in the house. There was no one staying with me. My wife was back in L.A. on this trip. And I went to one of the Indian casinos nearby for about an hour or so. When I came back, I collected the document. The ink was dry. It was normal. I tossed it on my bed and intended to crawl into bed and read through it and take notes. I went into the bathroom. I was there a few minutes. And when I came out and my eyes fell on the document, I immediately saw that it had been changed. It was different. There was moist black ink on it that was perfectly blacking out 4 words. And of the blackout, 2 of the words you could still kind of read, like translucent. But the other 2 words were absolutely 100% blacked out. Couldn't tell what they were. Now, I was in shock because there was no one there that could have done it. And this was not a case of a drip from the ceiling, landing with some water on the document and spreading some ink.
No, this wasn't a blotch.
It was precise. It was like a message. It was precise.
Right.
I didn't know what, who could have done it. There was no one there. What did it mean? I mean, at first I felt scared and a little bit threatened. And I didn't know I was going to go to sleep that night. And then, it was dry after about 4 or 5 minutes. The next morning, I took pictures of it. I had somebody I knew come in with an electromagnetic field reader, and we were checking out the house, and we got these massive EMF readings from a mask that was on display in the room, right next to where the ink thing happened. It was an African mask. It's from Zimbabwe. And that was really strange and hard to understand. There were no metal parts in it, and I filmed that. I really wanted to check out the ink. I felt I had some evidence of something. I didn't know what. And I had a contact to University of Indiana, the chairman of the chemistry department there, who's he just happens to be a world-class expert in inks and paints and solvents, Dr. J. Siegel. So I started with Dr. Siegel. I said, look, I don't want to FedEx this to you. I'm not willing to take any chance it gets lost. I'm going to hand deliver it. I'd like to bring a video camera. I'd like to film what you do in the lab and see if you can explain this away. And of course he expected he could explain it away. He can explain everything chemical. But it got really complicated. He started with gas chromatography. It didn't give him the answers he needed. Something really weird happened in his laboratory while he was doing it that, we discussed, as it happened there. And then he decided to bring in another chemist. So he had me fly to New Jersey, to the College of New Jersey, Dr. John Allison, who got so involved in this project, it became a huge project for him for 3 years. Can you believe it? He involved classes in it, students. They used the electron microscope. They absolutely could not duplicate this ink blot, however they tried.
So they're matching this ink blot with all known paint, pigments, solvents, other
everything.
Chemicals.
Yeah. Now, they are able to figure out that most of the chemistry of the ink blot, I mean, this gets a little technical, and I don't know if your listeners really want you can see the movie and get all the details. But what's interesting is that the ink, most of the chemistry matched the ink that was in the printer ink, which was a blue-black ink. But the problem was that there was so much more of it at that one particular spot, very, very evenly distributed, much more ink than was ever present in the words that were there. And it also had it had silver in it that wasn't in the original ink, and it had barium chromate, wasn't there. And they couldn't figure out how it could have been applied or laid down so precisely. And they tried everything, as I say, for a couple of years. And the more John Allison tried, and this is where it gets really hairy, because the more poltergeist types of things started happening to him. And one of the incidents was caught right on film while I was there, where a clock chimed that hadn't worked in 10 years and has never worked again since. He had an incident of pages that were in his dining room on a chair being scattered all across the floor while he was out of the room. There was no one who could have done it. No open windows. And I want to say, the plot really thickened when I found out later that the remodeled Acker Mansion, he was deceased, and somebody bought it, they remodeled it, they had tenants living there. And I spoke to the tenants who told me the house was haunted, and they didn't know anything about Forrest J. Ackerman and the, horror science fiction museum that had been there before. They knew only the barest details. They told me about incidents that happened in the house, and one of them exactly matched what was happening to the scientist in New Jersey, with the pages being...
This was the musician artist who would leave the room when she came back. Her papers were scattered.
At a music stand.
But at this point, let me just back up and remind listeners, Paul Davids is with us, filmmaker. The documentary is entitled The Life After Death Project.
And at this point... Tell them, let me just interject before you ask the question, Richard. I want them to know this was on Sci-Fi a couple nights ago. And we only arranged that they were going to show it once. And our site is lifeafterdeathproject.com. It has everything about it there. And the sequel, which is coming out with the DVD, so there's 2 movies. And all the bonus features and things. And I really would like to just take a moment to say a word to encourage your listeners to check that out there or at Amazon, and please do not support the piracy sites. You can't imagine the death knell that the piracy sites mean to the independent producers like me who independently finance their projects, work on them for years, maybe get a channel like Sci-Fi to show it, and the moment it's there, there's 1,000 people there who have no respect for copyright, and they all think that they can run away with it. And it just leaves us, with no way to recoup. And just please, if you've been supporting them, the torrent sites and that kind of thing, please stop. Understand it from our point of view. Or people like me who make these interesting films on controversial subjects and push the envelope, won't be able to make them anymore.
Exactly. And
that said, let's get back to your questions.
Yes, please give us the website again where people can...
It's lifeafterdeathproject.com.
Excellent.
Don't forget the word project.
Now this ink, I don't want to call it a blot because, as you say, it was precise.
Mm-hmm.
This ink line.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, I mean, you hadn't made necessarily the connection between this
and
ink
Ackerman.
And Ackerman. Explain what led...
No, I was more concerned about a possible connection between the mask and Ackerman, because Ackerman was a collection of all kinds of masks,
right.
And that African mask looked like something out of his favorite movie, King Kong. And but if this was a message, at first I didn't get it at all. I looked up what the words were, and it was... spoke to Joe Amoti. It was somebody I'd had one conversation with in my life about possibly distributing my film Jesus in India. It didn't happen. That was the day I spoke to him. I took that note down, and I didn't have any further business contact with him or anything. There was another little line on that front page that said, left message for Joe Amoti, a day or two before. And whoever crossed this out deliberately avoided left message for and crossed out, blotted out, spoke to Joe Amoti. So the issue had to do with speaking with someone, not leaving a message. And, the key to this that just jolted me because it made so much sense to me, because I knew Fari so well and I knew his sense of humor. And you have to understand, he was a punster. He was a master at wordplay. He could twist words, make jokes where he would find words within words and surprise you because he would see things in words you never did. And for example, one of his things was to take a word where there would be another word in the middle syllable. So if on the cover of Famous Monsters he wanted to say spectacular issue, it wouldn't just say spectacular, it would say spect, and then ACK, A-C-K, in big letters, and then Eular. Because they called him Ack. It was a nickname, Ackerman, Ack. And he did this again and again. I looked through things he had signed, things he had written, things in Famous Monsters. I found at least 15 examples of this, that this was his style, kind of his humor, his signature. Well, it didn't even occur to me. I was calling up his caretaker for the last 10 years of his life, the person who was closest to him, who answered to all of his needs and kept his life being a dignified life to the end.
He was there when he died, in fact.
Yeah, his name is Joe Mo from Hawaii. Loyal as anybody could be. And the reason I called Joe was I thought maybe he'd have some old Farhi manuscripts that would show how Farhi crossed out words when he was writing an article. And before I could even ask him about that, he said, Paul, I had the strangest experience after the tribute, a few days after the tribute. I said, I don't quite know how to describe it, but it was as though Farhi came and spoke to me. And he said, some people maybe call these things waking dreams, lucid dreams. He said it was right before I woke up and opened my eyes in the morning. If it was a dream, I was seeing my own room, and Farhi was there, and he came into my room, and then he told me what Farhi said to him, which was Farhi's funny way of thanking him for the tribute and telling him it was, the ninth wonder of the world. Not the eighth wonder, because the eighth wonder is King Kong, if you're in the
right,
business.
That's right.
Oh, by the way, Farhi's the guy that came up with the term sci-fi. That was another his little contribution. But, so Joe said it was like he was really there. And then suddenly I just, shake my head, open my eyes. I'm looking at the same thing, the scene in my bedroom, and there's no Farhi there. Everything else is the same. And he didn't know what to do with it because he's a skeptic. I mean, I think he's been a member of skeptic societies, and it's the way he thinks. And he knew Farhi didn't believe in life after death, and, he didn't have any reason to either. And I looked, at that moment, I just spoke to Joe Modi, and I was in shock because I realized Joe Mo's name is right there in the middle syllable of Modi. And it suddenly dawned on me, Farhi would do that. If he wanted to tell me he spoke to Joe Mo, he'd cross out spoke to Joe Modi and expect me to get it.
Right, and he has to work, and if he's trying to communicate with you, he's got to work with the available material, so he sees...
and do it in a way in which I would get it. But you see, it was a puzzle that I had to figure out, and he expected me to figure it out, rightly so. I think it probably took me longer to figure it out than he's probably thinking, come on, Paul, what's the matter with you? You don't get it yet? But...
And he didn't cross out the line earlier on that said left message with Joe. He said spoke.
No. So you see, it was precise and it was definite. Now, what I'd like your listeners to understand is this was the beginning. That was the first week of, I haven't counted the number of incidents that have happened, and I don't know whether you call them paranormal. Some of them are really improbable synchronicities, and some of them are just really, really strange things that shouldn't have happened but did and relate to Farhi. A couple of them were, again, impossible things, like the ink blot, things that just there's no physical explanation for how those things happen. And they kept happening to me at unexpected times over the course of the years. And even within the last few weeks, again, some of the most spectacular things have happened.
We'll take a time out here, Paul. Yeah. When we come back, maybe we can touch on the article you wrote for Fate magazine.
Okay.
And then we'll get into the science of this and how you went down and took all this information to Professor Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona. And this is where the science really comes in. And this stuff is compelling, the scientific evidence for this. Paul Davids, The Life After Death Project, right here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away.
As you're staring up at the night sky, ever wonder who's staring back? You're listening to Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Let me beg your indulgence for just 1 second before we get back to my conversation with the filmmaker responsible for the Life After Death Project. If you could, just take a moment at some point and log on to Indiegogo.com. That's the crowdfunding platform, Indiegogo, and check out my beloved's Mighty Aphrodite's campaign there, Adopt a Greek Olive Tree. Adopt a Greek Olive Tree on Indiegogo, and would appreciate it. All right. Paul Davids is with us. The Life After Death Project, the first paranormal biography, the afterlife story of Forrest J. Ackerman, a founding father of Hollywood science fiction who refuses to rest in peace. Now, at some point, you were asked to write an article for the legendary Fate magazine, and tell us what happened, Paul.
I want to do that, but I want to interject something since you're the conspiracy show that has to do with another article first, if I may.
Please do.
This week, just a couple of days ago, Huffington Post wrote an article about this, about the Life After Death Project. Very comprehensive. Written by Lee Spiegel.
Yes, he's terrific.
And Lee spoke to the science people involved, and he did link to the scientific journals that had published papers. It was done extremely well. And he approached the science department of Huffington Post to try to get it picked up as a science story, and was turned down. And, they just flatly refused. And it's the old way of thinking about this, that since it can't be true, it isn't. And it sounds sort of tabloid. And, do they prove it beyond any doubt? Forget about reasonable doubt. Is it absolutely proven? And if it isn't, put it in the weird news section. So
yeah, that's so unfortunate.
I do want to encourage your listeners to go to the Huffington Post, look at the article. It's under weird news. It's a really good piece about this, and it'll fill in some of the things we might not cover here. But it's unfortunate that, just like with UFOs, it's the way things are.
Well, I know that Michael Shermer is featured in the film. I've met Michael a few times at his office in Pasadena and included him in my television show. God bless Michael Shermer, but that guy, I don't think he believes in air. I mean, I think he would argue against the existence of air. But the thing is...
what's funny? If you read his biography, he started out as a fundamentalist Christian. I mean, he was going to a college for that. And then he had a massive rejection against all of that and turned around and he threw it all out, threw out the baby with the bathwater. And he thinks in his book, Why People Believe Weird Things, that because he's able to learn how to give a cold reading as though he's a psychic and fool somebody, because it's possible to be a charlatan and an imposter and get somebody to play along, that means that there is no truth to any of it. And I'm convinced he's absolutely wrong, and that they're missing real data that is of scientific value.
Well, they say, show me the scientific data. When you show it to them, then they question the protocols and the way this experiment was being done. But wait till wait till people listening to this program watch your film and see the mediums that took on this case.
Oh, it was extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
It came through Gary Schwartz. But you wanted to hear about Fate magazine. I'll
Yes.
tell them very quickly. Fate magazine wanted me to write an article about the strange case of Forrest J. Ackerman for an issue they had dealing with artist Frank R. Paul. He was one of the top pulp cover artists of those magazines. Wonderful science fiction imagery, and Forrest Ackerman was a collector of his work. So they wanted me to write an article, and I did, telling them that there seemed to be evidence that he'd been heard from since he passed away. But when the article came back from the printer, it wasn't the way I wrote it. There on the first page, about 3 paragraphs down, sort of reminds you of the ink blot, there's huge typographical error that goes on for sentences. And what it is it breaks away from what I had actually written, and it suddenly says, I'm trying to remember the exact words, but I think it was essentially the obliterating ink. 2 levels of opacity. Spoke to Joe Amodi. The obliterating ink, it repeats again. 2 levels of opacity, which means it was 2 different levels of blackness on the ink. Spoke to Joe Amodi. Repeating it again and again, and then it goes back into the story as I actually wrote it. Well, the first reaction you get when you open the magazine where you've written an article, you see something like that, is to say, oh, come on. They couldn't have proofread it better than that. They've got this big mistake. Nobody's going to understand.
Not Phyllis. She's pretty fastidious. She's pretty fastidious.
It's not a mistake.
Yeah.
I called up the publisher, Phyllis Galdi, and she was flabbergasted. She said, look, we had 2 regular proofreaders and 2 editors. It wasn't like that when it went to the press. So it's again another link in the chain of these strange things again that point to Ackerman.
All right, we'll come back and talk about Dr. Gary Schwartz and his amazing work on the survival of consciousness after death down at the University of Arizona, and the fact that you took this information down to Gary Schwartz and some of the tests that he ran. Absolutely compelling evidence for life after death. The Life After Death Project filmmaker Paul Davids joins us here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away.
It's time to redefine reality. This is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet.
Syret. Welcome back. Quick programming note coming up on the weeks ahead here on The Conspiracy Show. I'll speak with one of the founders of the Merlin Project. This is an amazing piece of technology that utilizes the internet to make predictions, future trends, and so forth. Also, self-described crackpot historian Adam Gorightly will be here to talk about some of the mysterious deaths of some famous comedians over the years. Everyone from George Carlin, Lenny Bruce, on and on. And we'll speak with a whistleblower from inside the World Bank. This is a senior legal counsel with the World Bank turned whistleblower, now facing criminal prosecution because she dared speak out about what's going on inside the World Bank. Right now, a few moments remain with Paul Davids, filmmaker, as we discuss his latest project, an amazing documentary, The Life After Death Project. All right, so you approach Dr. Gary Schwartz down at the University of Arizona, who's the director of the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health. Tell me about what he made of when you first approached him and told him about what was going on. What did he say?
Well, he asked me every question he could think of to try to ascertain the credibility of it and my credibility. And then he invited me down. I asked him for an interview for the film. And I learned from him, at that time, he was doing research in 2 different directions related to life after death. One direction had to do with using mediums who were, he calls it double-blind experiments, where they have absolutely no foreknowledge of who it is you're trying to get a message from. And he was also doing work with computer software he was designing to facilitate contact between this world and the next that could be measurable through very, very subtle energies like gamma rays and very subtle levels of light in pitch black, through attempting a communication and seeing if there was a meaningful timed response. And he has been successful in that work. And it has he's had a peer-reviewed paper published about it. His experimental protocols have all been approved by the university. And he's accomplished a lot, and he's moving on.
Put that in your pipe, Michael Shermer.
But we started with one of the mediums who had done many readings for him in Tucson, Arizona. Her name is Catherine Yunt. She's been in a couple of documentary films, not necessarily as a medium. Her background is she's a math teacher, but she has this ability to bring forth information, and it's very strange. You don't know how could she know these things. It's as though she really is speaking with someone unseen. With me, he called her on the spur of the moment and said, "Look, there's a man here I'd like to bring to you. He's going to have a video camera. He'd like to tape this. I'm not going to mention his name. There's somebody he'd like to hear from and see if that person could come through you." And we got there. I set up. And at first, we weren't even going to tell the name of the person I wanted to contact, even the first name. But Gary said his name was Forrest because she thought it would help to know the name. And over the course of about an hour, she gave a lot of information that just hit the nail on the head. It was very, very specific to Forrest J. Ackerman's personality, his sense of humor. It wasn't perfect, and the best information didn't necessarily come right at the beginning. It sort of warmed into it. And the things that she came up with, though, as I say, it was so specific to Fari. There were a lot of them. And it amazed me. It was many months later when there was a psychic who's well known in Israel who was coming to the University of Arizona to meet with Gary, that he invited me back. I flew in again. We did a reading with Orit Ishyemini Tomer, is her name. And her reading was absolutely fantastic, too.
You told her nothing.
Nothing, no. She pulled out of the air, I think his name, the one you want to talk to, his name, should it begin with an F? She says an F or a P. She says in Hebrew, I'm seeing in Hebrew, same letter, it's one or the other. And we said, well, it's an F. And she went from there. And she brought out that there was money from writing, that he was involved in publishing a funny magazine, a strange magazine, that parents didn't necessarily like it. Parents didn't necessarily approve of their children following after him. She said she saw this collection that he had of funny little dolls, she said. She didn't have the word for monster. Her English wasn't perfect. But she said strange little dolls, and she said some of them, she says, it's like Yoda, that kind of thing. Which is, of course, exactly right. And then I asked, well, what about the women in his life? And she says, there's one woman. One woman in particular, it's his wife. She's the one person who knows everything about him. Her name begins with an M. Okay? Well, as far as I knew, his wife's name didn't begin with an M. She was Wendane. So an M upside down, but it's not an M. Wendane Ackerman. Everybody knew her as Wendy. But then I learned after this, Wendane was not her real name. And we had to hunt for her real name. And there were archives that I had obtained at the estate sale, the estate auction, Forrest Jack. Some of his binders of writings that went way back, and his wife's real name was Matilda, sometimes called Mondel. 3 versions of her original name, and they all began with an M.
Wow.
So where did Orit Ishyemini Tomer get this from? If not from Fari, she sure didn't get it by picking my brain.
And she described him as kind of a strange little child.
A childlike. She said he has 2 sides to his personality. He's a childlike with a strange laughter. He'll laugh at things that other people won't even laugh about. They might not find them funny. That's very true. And she said, but on the other side, he also has a very serious side. And that's true, too. I mean, he was a scholar of science fiction.
She talked about his wordplay as well, did she not?
The one who really talked about his wordplay was Catherine Yunt. And she got right at that, at play on words as being his type of humor, that he had a very abrupt kind of poke-you sense of humor that involved wordplay. And she said, he's telling me I can't see the forest for the trees right now.
Which is exactly something that Ack would say, right?
He would say, he's Forrest. So you need to see the movie to appreciate it. Now, when the skeptics heard about it, of course, what do I hear from them right away? Right away. They said, were these did you see 15 skeptics and these were 15 mediums and these are the best?
Yeah, what did you leave out?
What did you leave out? What did you leave on the cutting room floor? And look, each one of these interviews was an hour. The whole movie's an hour and 45 minutes. I'm not going to have their whole hour. Of course I cherry-picked the best stuff. But the best stuff is representative of what took place during the whole hour. And, I would be a good judge of this. I'm not trying to make this be true. If I had been disappointed with either of these mediums or felt that they were off base, I would have been the first one to say so. I would have turned to Gary and say, this is a big miss, Gary. This is a flop. And Gary, of course, didn't know whether most of these things related to Forrest or not. He'd never met Forrest. He didn't know. He had to hear from me that they were right about this and this and this and this and this and this and on and on. And, of course, at the core of this is the fact that there have been probably around 20 more really strange incidents over the last 4 years. A few of them taking place really recently, like right when we heard that Sci-Fi was going to broadcast the movie. That very day, the weirdest thing happened to me. I have a face mask of Fari that I got at the estate auction that I keep in my office. I have weird science fiction collectibles in my office. I'm a producer, and I have the alien from our movie Roswell that we made for Showtime.
Great movie, by the way.
It's really cool. It's in this display case, and on top of the case, I've had Fari's face sitting there for 4 years since I got this thing. It has never moved. I've never touched it. I've never moved it. But I went out for lunch that day. I left my house for about an hour and a half. The house is locked. My wife is at her job at Universal, at the studio. No one is in my house. And when I come back and go into my office, the first thing I see is that Fari's face has moved. It's moved 10 feet. It's now on the floor across the room, buried in all my computer wires by my hard drives. And someone said jokingly, I think he's trying to tell you he's getting his nose into your computer and he's communicating with you, through technology. Maybe, but there was nothing to move that mask. And at the same time, I get back and my computer goes down. I have to reboot everything. And when it had gone down, I didn't have things related to Fari Ackerman on the screen. When it booted back up, on each screen is an open folder filled with files about Ackerman and his magazine, Famous Monsters.
Wow.
And while I was out for that hour and a half, a car swerves in front of me with a vanity license plate that says AM loves FM. And FM is, Famous Monsters is a big sign in my office. Come meet the editor of FM, Famous Monsters. And I said jokingly to the current editor of Famous Monsters magazine, Ed Blair, because it's still being published by Phil Kim. You can still find it. It's really cool. I said to Ed, I know FM, Famous Monsters, but, AM. He said Ackerman, AM, or Ackermonster, loves FM, of course. All of this happened in that same hour. And again and again and again, the list is long. So look, the skeptics want to... I read that somebody who runs a column online that's called I Doubt It. He had a flash news thing saying, look, just got this story, Huffington Post, did this article about friends of Fari Ackerman say he's speaking to them from beyond, he's talking to them from beyond the grave. He says, didn't have time to get to it tomorrow, but I'm working on a headline for this, and I doubt it. Well, this is what you get from these people.
Right. The thing the scientists or skeptics will say is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And
I've got the extraordinary evidence. I've got it from 3 universities. I've got it from electron microscope work. Look, wonderful things sometimes come in very small packages. And in this case, the message that kicked it all off was really small. Someone else might have missed it entirely or just shrugged it away. But scientists, they study molecules. They study atoms. They study subatomic particles. They study very, very faint messages coming to us. I don't mean messages, but from exploding pulsars and stars that are 4 billion years old coming to us very, very faint. So very subtle things. This ink blot, by comparison to those things, is huge. It's got a lot of molecules. It's got a lot you can study.
Right.
And it's there.
And we haven't even talked about some of the other experiments that Dr. Schwartz conducted,
which we see in real time on the movie as he's communicating with Forrest J. Ackerman.
Unbelievable. Quickly, last question. Before you made this film, what was your opinion about life after death?
I just felt maybe, nobody knows, we can never know. I loved reading Paramahansa Yogananda and his stories about reincarnation, and I thought, could it be true? But I didn't believe in any of the past life regression or just big unanswered questions, and I didn't dwell on it.
And now?
Oh, I think this is real. That consciousness survives, and so does personality. So even can a sense of humor, and that contact between our world and that other world can happen, and we can amplify it. And that's what Gary Schwartz is working on doing now at the University of Arizona.
Congratulations. Great film. The Life After Death Project. And again, where should people go?
please go to lifeafterdeathproject.com. You can sell it there. Oh, we have a coupon code, LADP. We'll save you some postage, or it's at Amazon, and it's going to be there with the sequel, coming to you with the sequel and bonus features with Ray Bradbury, Rick Baker. I put the whole package together.
Excellent.
Don't go to the piracy sites. I hate them.
Excellent work, Paul, and we'll talk again, I hope.
Thank you. Loved it.
Good night.
Good night.
Tim Spreen, thank you. Back next week. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light, and what I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite. I'm coming home.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.